Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine. Now, today, as I speak, if you were to turn on the mainstream media here in the United States, you get very little information about the ongoing conflict. You hear about the Western weapons deliveries. You really don't hear too much about the performance of said weapon systems. A lot of weapon systems that have been handed over to the Ukrainians that were at one point once very much ballyhooed, that were being given credit for causing the Russians many challenges and problems. Now, that has changed. If you remember at the very onset of the war, the Ukrainians were making videos, music videos, about the TB2 Bayraktar. There were discussions about the Javelin, the In-Law, other weapon systems that the Ukrainians are using. Now, in many cases, that discussion has gone silent, and especially, again, in reference to the TB2 Bayraktar, the Turkish-made drone that has the ability to launch the very effective MAML air-to-surface anti-tank guided or anti-bunker guided weapon system. Now, right now, essentially, the TB2 doesn't have the ability to fly over eastern Ukraine because of a couple of different things. One, Russian electronic warfare, and then obviously Russian air defenses has changed the way they are able to engage some of these systems. Earlier in the conflict, it was more difficult for the Russians to counter some of these systems, but they have adapted, they've overcome, they've changed, and now that system is no longer prevalent on the battlefield. It's no longer being used. Most of them have been destroyed. Now, additionally, here in the United States and Western Europe, you get the impression that the war has stagnated, that the Russians no longer have the ability to launch large-scale offensive operations. Now look, that is a misconception. What the Russians are doing, they are using some of their more effective weapon systems to degrade and destroy Ukrainian forces through a war of attrition. I've talked about this before, and it is very difficult to obtain information about some of these Russian strikes, some of these ongoing Russian strikes that have occurred within the last 48 hours, or for that matter, over the course of the last year, and how effective these strikes have been on Ukrainian forces. Now, some of the most lethal weapon systems that the Russians are using is not the main battle tank. It is not unguided heavy artillery. Some of the most lethal weapon systems that the Russians are using right now and have been using are systems such as the Iskander that have been incredibly successful and are continuing to be incredibly successful in striking Ukrainian both battlefield targets and rear area targets. Everything from command and control nodes to supply depots to areas where the Russians believe that Ukrainian forces are being housed in makeshift barracks or converted civilian structures into military structures. The glide bomb. Hundreds of these are being launched every week at Ukrainian forces and are methodically destroying Ukrainian defensive positions. And that continues as we speak today. Another weapon system for deep penetration strikes, the KH-59/69. This is a low observable cruise missile that we believe has taken advantage of some of the weapon systems that have been shot down, such as the Storm Shadow, Scalp, Western design, low observable cruise missiles. The Russians now have many of these systems that either failed to explode or they have parts of these systems that they're now reverse engineering and creating systems of their own. Now look, the Russians had very similar systems. Were they as low observable as some of these Western systems that are being used right now, again, such as the Storm Shadow? Probably not. Are they as accurate? I would say right now, as of today, yes, very much so. The Russians are able to identify targets, and they are able to destroy those targets almost at leisure. The challenge is finding those targets. And there's a great many ways the Russians are doing that. Now, at the same time, the Ukrainians are kind of doing the same thing with the HIMARS and some of their other long-distance attack systems. Now, that is becoming more difficult for the Ukrainians because of the Russian electronic warfare capability. But if you go back to the 1991 Gulf War, and the lead up to the ground operations that eventually liberated Kuwait and drove Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, that 30 to 40 day air campaign is very much what we are seeing the type of strategy the Russians using as we speak. The Russians are using their at-distance attack capability to degrade and destroy Ukrainian forces, and this is happening daily. Now, at the same time, the Russians do mount limited offensive operations on the ground. We are starting to see these new battle groups taking shape. They are much larger in size and scope than the battle groups that we seen the Russians deploying a year and a half ago. The Russians are creating these 10,000 plus personnel, these divisional size or understrength core size battle groups that continue to hammer and press forward and gain territory day in and day out. And it's happening. The casualty levels, again, because the Ukrainians don't report casualties. There's no discussion of casualties. The only casualties that the Ukrainians will report are civilian casualties. And if you look at the size and the scope of this war and what is being used and the different weapon systems that are being used, the civilian casualties thus far have been remarkably low. And part of that is, I would say, the restraint of both sides not to hit and completely annihilate civilian targets. Now, some of these battlefield cities that are on the front line, obviously that's a different story. Once civilians are vacated from some of those areas, then obviously it becomes a free-for-all, and many of these cities have been and will be rubblized as the front line continues to expand and move forward on the part of the Russians. But that's kind of where we sit. We anticipate and we believe right now that the Ukrainians are in fact taking many more casualties than the Russians. Now, as I've talked about the mainstream media before, they would lead you to believe that the Russians are taking many more casualties and the Ukrainians are bleeding the Russians dry. That's not happening. Again, if you look at the Russian strategy, the use of these different weapon systems that are being used by the Russians, and they're being used on a massive scale, especially these glide bombs. Scanders are being used probably up to a dozen a day, hitting a variety of Ukrainian military targets. Now that is causing casualties, and the Ukrainians right now are suffering hundreds of casualties per day. Well, we've talked about the problems and challenges within the scope of the Ukrainian military of getting personnel to join the military. Well, there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is massive casualties. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, if you look at the Russians, they are not suffering the same sort of recruiting challenges. The Russians are growing their military 30,000+ troops per month. They do not have a mandatory state conscription process, meaning they're not pressing people into military service. That's not happening. Troops that are joining the Russian military right now to fight on the front lines are, for the most part, volunteer forces. That is not the case with the Ukrainian military. Very few individuals now are volunteering for Ukrainian military service. They're being pressed in to military service via mandatory conscription. And the reason they're not joining, the Ukrainians are not joining the military, is one, they believe eventually they're going to lose. And then more importantly, two, there is a high degree of probability that if you join the Ukrainian military, at some point you are going to be struck down by an Iskander, a glide bomb, or a cruise missile. And these systems right here are what is causing the majority of casualties of the Ukrainian forces. Right now, these are the most effective and lethal systems that the Russians are using in this conflict. Iskanders, cruise missiles, these semi-ballistic high-precision cruise missiles, and glide bombs. And that's going to continue, again, until the Ukrainian military simply breaks. And at some point, that is going to happen, especially since the Ukrainian military does not really have an air force. The Russians have an air force. They are using that air force, and they are using that air force to slowly whittle away, degrade, destroy, and break the Ukrainian military. And that's what we're seeing happening. So more to come as we continue to report. Thank you for joining us today. As always, have a good day.